These are more targeted crimes, and I think they're very specific.
Crime scene tape and a sharp increase in investigations surrounding violence against the LGBTQ plus community. How murder and violence against this group impacts our community as a whole. This is In Focus. Violence against the LGBTQ plus community, especially transgender people, it's increasing across the country. And the Anti-Violence Project tells us they're seeing an 86% increase in hate-related murders in that community. In Focus's Jeff Allen explains that violence is hitting here at home.
Mulan Montrese Williams is no stranger to violence.
I've been raped 3 times. I've been robbed about 5. About 8 guns pulled on me.
Violence, she says, came along with being a sex worker. The only work, she says, would allow her to be herself, a transgender woman.
I remember I got hired for one job, and then I went in and it was like, oh no, you can't come like that.
Williams now puts out condoms and opens up her Orlando home as a safe space for other members of the transgender community. But her safe haven wasn't enough to keep Sasha Garden from losing her life.
Her dream was to complete her transition, go back home to Milwaukee and open up a salon and just be this fabulous hairdresser. You know, that was her dream.
Garden was found dead in Orlando back in July. Investigators with the Orange County Sheriff's Office say her case is still open and active, but there's been no arrests. Garden's sister recently reached out to us from Wisconsin, saying she was frustrated she wasn't getting enough information about her sister's case.
It's hurtful when you don't know what happened to your family member.
She says she'll continue to keep checking with law enforcement and hopes she'll eventually find out who killed her sister and why.
I'm not gonna never stop because she wouldn't gave up on me if she was here. I'm not gonna stop until I get justice.
The Anti-Violence Project reports last year was the deadliest year on record for the transgender community, with at least 29 transgender people killed across the country.
These are more targeted crimes, and I think they're very specific, and that's really the scary part.
Nicole Parker advocates for fellow transgender people. She believes a spike in violence can at least partially be attributed to more cases being reported. And Parker believes the progress her community has made might also contribute to some violence.
We're living out loud and living proud, and there's weeks dedicated to this. I think that upsets some people.
It's like bringing more attention to us, and for some people it's not good attention.
Williams says many transgender people are still afraid to report crimes to police, but she hopes one day that's not the case.
I'm never losing hope, because we are going to be respected as humans one day.
In Orange County, Jeff Allen, In Focus.
And the 29 deaths Jeff talked about, those happened in 2017, and the Human Rights Campaign reports 26 transgender people died last year due to violence, and there are 2 reported deaths so far this year. So here to put this issue in focus right now, we have State Representative Carlos Guillermo-Smith representing District 49 here in Orange County. Thanks for being with us here. From Equality Florida, and Pulse survivor Brandon Wolf with us as well. And in Tallahassee, Patrick Slevin from the group Conservatives on the Right Side of Equality. So honored to have each of you here with us today on In Focus. And, you know, we thought this was, of course, an important topic to talk about as Orlando celebrates diversity here in Central Florida during one magical weekend. And then later this month, it's June 21st through the 23rd, St. Pete Pride in the Tampa Bay area. So first, you know, Jeff talked about the increase in violence against the LGBTQ plus community. So I want to talk big picture. If you're not a member of this community, does this still impact you? You know, when we talk about these hate crimes, how does it impact our community as a whole, socially, economically, and politically? Representative, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, I also want to acknowledge that it's also Pride Month in June. And so it's really important that we talk about LGBTQ issues, that we talk about not only inclusivity and not necessarily tolerance, but acceptance of those who are different than us. The reality is that hate crimes are on the rise. Particularly against the LGBTQ community, particularly against transgender women of color. We heard the story about Sasha Garden, who was a black transgender woman who was killed in July of last year right here in Orlando. But it was a stunning reminder that that was actually one of 4 deaths, murders of transgender women in Florida within 5 months. We know that Florida has a particular problem with this epidemic, and I think it's important that people understand that hate violence and hate crimes are meant to send a message of fear into particular communities. It's meant to send a message that they are not supposed to exist, that if they do exist, that they should hide, and if they can't hide, then whatever happens to them is their own fault. And that's something that we have to tackle as a society, and part of that includes changing our laws.
You know, so Patrick, let's be upfront here. When you have Republicans and Democrats, Republicans, they don't have the better reputation when it comes to issues surrounding the LGBTQ plus community. So I'm just curious, are you and your group trying to change that party-wide?
Absolutely. Look, education is a key component. You can't fight hate and violence when you have an ignorance or a lack of awareness. And admittedly, from the center-right community, that is conservatives and Republicans, it's still an issue that's foreign. So we're trying to build the bridges through bipartisan efforts and our grassroots effort and network across the state to reach out to more conservatives and Republicans, and to put this front and center that any crime, hate crime against LGBTQ communities is a crime against all of us. And we're making inroads and changing those paradigms. And we're very optimistic as we head into the future and working in a bipartisan fashion to break down those paradigms and those stereotypes so we can protect the LGBT community in a bipartisan fashion.
So then, Patrick, have you or your group reached out to Governor Ron DeSantis? Because critics, they did blast him for not including sexual orientation and gender identity in his executive order on workplace discrimination earlier this year. But I just want to note that Agriculture Commissioner Nikki Fried ended up revising that for her office. So talk to me about that.
Sure. The Conservatives on the Right Side of Equality is a 501c3 nonprofit. So we're not an advocacy public affairs group. We're an education component. We're funded and founded by Save Florida, LGBT group out of South Florida that's been around for decades and considered one of the most prestige LGBT groups in the country. And so we are not heading right into lobbying per se, like Equality Florida and other groups. We're working from a grassroots bottom-up strategy and cultivating Republicans who are county commissioners, city commissioners, young Republicans, legislators, and building from a grassroots movement to influence the Republican paradigm that we have here in Tallahassee. And we're making progress, and we continue to work forward to have those impacts in the governor's office and leadership in both the House and Senate.
You're nodding your head, Brandon, of course, as one of the lobbyists. So what did you push for with the governor?
Yeah, so we gave this opportunity to Governor Rick Scott several times to pass an executive order, to sign an executive order that would protect the LGBTQ folks working for the state from discrimination based on sexual identity and gender orientation. And he failed to do that. He chose not to do that. He made a whole lot of excuses as to why he would not do that. We put it in front of him multiple times following the shooting at Pulse. He told us he would eventually get to it, and then something seemed to get in the way. He couldn't find his pen, or his coffee cup spilled on it. I'm not sure what happened that got in the way of him signing it, but he never ended up signing it. So our hope was that, with new leadership, with some change, we saw a lot of bipartisan momentum, I think, around LGBTQ protections. And so I think we expected Governor Ron DeSantis to do what Rick Scott failed to do. It's unfortunate that he chose not to do that. I would love to, right now, ask him again to come to the table, to have a conversation with us, and to sign an executive order to protect state LGBTQ workers.
Representative Jennifer Webb and Senator Darrell Roustan, they filed the Florida Competitive Workforce Act, and that would have ensured all LGBTQ Floridians are protected from discrimination in not just employment, but also housing and public spaces. So this thing failed in session. So, when folks see how their lawmakers respond or not respond, Representative, this is for you. Does this give maybe a greener light to those with maybe discriminatory tendencies, a greener light to speak louder?
I'm glad that you asked that question, Allison, because the reality is that what lawmakers do and what lawmakers don't do matters. It sends a message. The fact that former Governor and now Senator Rick Scott refused to send a message after Pulse, where 49 mostly LGBTQ people of color were murdered in a safer space, an LGBTQ nightclub, that he wouldn't even sign a simple values document to say that state employees who are LGBTQ cannot be discriminated against. That sent a really ugly message about who we are. But it's not too late. I'm really optimistic based on the work that Patrick Slevin and Conservatives for Equality are doing to try to promote this as a conservative ideology and idea that we don't discriminate against people simply because of who they are, but instead we treat people based on what they're capable of doing, particularly in the workplace. This year, you mentioned the Florida Competitive Workforce Act. It had 74 co-sponsors in both the Florida House and Senate, and 15 of those co-sponsors were Republicans. That's 20% of the endorsed support through co-sponsorship for comprehensive pro-LGBTQ protections, and I see that as a really, really positive sign moving forward.
We have lots to dig into here on this topic, so let's pause right now. Coming up, one state bill this past legislative session aimed at repealing every local LGBTQ rights law in Florida. Is equality in jeopardy in Florida? That conversation when we return right here on In Focus. Hold on. And back here on In Focus, talking about violence and discrimination aimed at the LGBTQ community. So Equality Florida fought hard against one particular bill in this last legislative session. That's House Bill 3. So Equality Florida said if passed, it would repeal every local LGBTQ rights law in the state. So Brandon, talk to us about this bill, and was your fight successful? Because this basically just would have stripped the local government of its power, right?
That's right. Yeah, we were assured by leadership in the House and the Senate that this was an unintended consequence of the bill, but whether unintended or intentional, it was a potential consequence of House Bill 3. So this came to our attention, and we brought it forth in our lobbying efforts. And what was surprising to me is many lawmakers actually weren't aware of the impacts of House Bill 3. They were not well versed in really the language of it, and so some of these things took them by surprise. And what we cautioned was we don't want to see Florida turn into the next North Carolina, right? And we see that when we have these broad, sweeping preemption measures that strip local ordinances away and county ordinances away, we risk tens of millions of dollars in financial blowback as companies decide to leave the state. Companies really look for an environment that's inclusive. They look for an environment that's going to be healthy and safe for their workers. And Florida threatened with House Bill 3 to remove that tag from this state. So we effectively neutralized that in the House. Several amendments were passed to protect LGBT ordinances across the state. We kept our eyes on it as it moved through toward the Senate, but we were successful in those lobbying efforts.
So I do want to explore that though further, because again, here's the economic part of this conversation. We alluded to at the beginning of the conversation. The Human Rights Campaign says this bill that we're talking about, it would, have caused the same economic turmoil in Florida like we did see in North Carolina. That state lost, it was $630 million in tourism, conventions, canceled events. That was in the aftermath of the passing of a repeal of local protections. So I want to know, Representative, what are your colleagues in Tallahassee attempting to accomplish with this bill? Obviously, some of them felt there was something to gain.
Well, really what House Bill 3 was in its inception was a preemption of local government authority. I believe that pro-LGBT human rights ordinances ended up getting caught up in it, but what's notable is how quickly the majority party in Tallahassee, the Republicans, were to try to undo what the impact was going to be on the LGBTQ community when they realized what Equality Florida and other organizations were saying, not only because they didn't want to have a reputation of being anti-LGBTQ, but I think they understood what the economic consequences were and what the outcomes were after North Carolina passed an anti-LGBTQ bill and billions of dollars left the state. But rather than talking about also what the economic consequences are for anti-LGBTQ laws, we also have to talk about what the economic benefits are when we name Florida as a state that is welcome and open for business for everyone. When we do pass inclusive laws that protect the LGBTQ community from discrimination, that actually means companies like Amazon are going to want to bring locations and headquarters to Florida because that's part of their value statement. They know that having an inclusive workforce, an inclusive place to live, an inclusive state to live, makes their employees more productive and gives them more business.
And you, Patrick, there are critics, though, the Florida Family Council, for example, who say that these protections create maybe a new lawsuit, which can be used as a weapon by disgruntled employees to sue employers, claiming they're fired because of subjective notions of sexual orientation or gender identity. They also say these protections punish free speech and freedom of religion and that they don't belong anywhere near a Republican platform. Talk to me.
Well, these kind of groups have a rhetoric of fear, and it's basically it's not true. But to play to folks is to citizens' fears of change and not understanding the LGBT community, and it has been effective, but it's not as effective as it was years ago, and that's where the hope for equality is there front and center. The hope is we have Republicans who are not listening to that rhetoric and really understanding that we do have to have anti-discrimination laws passed. But the problem has been for Republicans, and mind you, we have a majority of Republicans in the House, Senate, and the executive branch, as well as the cabinet, other than Nikki Fry, the Ag Commissioner, who haven't had a place to go. On the left, you have progressives telling Republicans that if you don't do anything, go to hell. And then on the right, the radical right, you got the Bible thumpers saying if you pass anything, you are going to hell. So there's been this desert of center-right conservatives who want to do the right thing, take care of the economy, take care of the LGBT community because it's good for all of us. And that's why the conservatives on the right side of equality has filled that gap. And we have LGBT groups like Save Florida and others who are working with them to not have that rhetoric that you led off with have an impact. And we see progress as evidenced by the chairman of the Republican Party, Senator Joe Gruters, who had Senate Bill 438, the Florida Inclusive Workforce Act, which is born out of the Florida Workforce
And Patrick, just to jump in here, we have to pause really quickly for our final break, Patrick. So next on In Focus, the discrimination and violence against transgender people sometimes starts at home and within the gay community itself. So we discuss how to talk about those uncomfortable and emotional conversations. In Focus on Spectrum Networks, coming right back. Hold on. This year, St. Pete Pride is focusing on raising awareness about transgender issues, holding a Trans Pride March and inviting the entire community to celebrate the trans families. So I want to know, Brandon, with that said, does the transgender community also struggle with acceptance within the gay community?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have not talked about transgender issues enough or for long enough. And for a long time, I think there was a lot of misunderstanding. I think there was a lot of ignorance inside the LGB community about the T part. But I'm really proud of the work that Equality Florida is doing through the Transaction Program and other groups across the country that are bringing awareness to transgender issues, how difficult it is to be trans, to come out as trans, and are providing support for those folks.
And Representative, you can identify with many survivors of a hate crime because you, in fact, are a survivor. Didn't happen at home, but it happened while you were in college at UCF, right? So still, though, many in the LGBTQ community, they face discrimination and violence for the first time at home, especially in the trans community. So how should we approach these conversations?
Thank you for asking me about that, Allison. It's true. I am a survivor of anti-LGBTQ hate violence. When I was a college student at UCF in 2003, 16 years ago, I was 22 years old. I had just came out as gay, and I was attacked viciously at a keg party near UCF because of who I was. The state attorney's office at the time, even back in 2003, brought forward hate crimes charges under the state's hate crime law, which does offer protections based on sexual orientation. I remember my feeling at the time. My feeling at the time was I had just come out, and I felt, is this what my life is going to be like as an out gay man? I'm going to be targeted for violence. I'm going to be a survivor of violence for the rest of my life. I'm going to have to constantly be looking behind my back. That's why it's so important that we pass inclusive hate crimes protections at the state level, and we also raise awareness around what negative rhetoric, what hateful rhetoric can do to promote hate violence, which we know is on the rise against the LGBT community. We know that it's underreported, and too often people don't speak up about their experiences with anti-LGBTQ hate violence.
And Patrick, you've mentioned religion in a number of your interviews. So one of your quotes is this: it's God's love is profound and beyond our comprehension, but the self-righteous conveniently overlook this fact as they cast stones from their glass houses. And there it is right there. So how big of a component, Patrick, is religion in this conversation?
Oh, it is a factor that we can't ignore, and it's one of the obstacles. And as a conservative, I look at the U.S. Constitution. We live in the greatest country in the world. You should be anyone that you want to be, and not be criticized. We shouldn't have these social mores and values that penalize someone for wanting to be who he or she wants to be and feels that they want to be. We should be celebrating that as Americans. And so that's why we need to. A religious base is necessary. We're one nation under God, but we have a plurality, and we have a secular government that protects its citizens. And so as a conservative and as a group, we celebrate being Americans, and government should not be interfering, or at the very least be guided by certain religions with certain kind of judgments. Because the love of God is profound, and it's beyond our comprehension.
And speaking of celebration, one magical weekend that wraps up tomorrow in Orlando, and then St. Pete Pride is the weekend of June 21st through the 23rd. So thank you, gentlemen, so much for joining us here on In Focus.
Thank
Folks,
you. Happy Pride.
Happy Pride, absolutely. I'm Allison Walker-Torres. Appreciate your company. We'll see you right here on In Focus next week.